So I've come to you in that spirit. I came with a prepared text, as you may have seen, but listening to Mr. Gurumurthy and hearing these comments, and at his own request to address one question on the UN and another one on the Maldives, I thought there were 6 issues that came up in his interaction that I may perhaps begin by saying a few words about, and then I will give you an abbreviated part of my prepared remarks in case any of that is of interest. But since there were 6 things during the interaction that I thought would be worth addressing, I'll depart from my text and talk about those. The first, you asked Mr. Gurumurthy for me to say a few words about the relevance of the United Nations today. And it's true that there are major conflicts raging, the Russia-Ukraine war, the Gaza war, and we are in a situation in which the UN appears to be helpless. But the truth of the matter is, the UN was designed in a particular way as a result of historical experience. In the last century, we had the First World War, which resulted in immense destruction, the greatest amount of loss of life that had ever been seen up to that point. And so the world decided to create an international body to prevent its recurrence, and they came up with the body called the League of Nations. But within 25 years of the start of the First World War, the Second World War started. The League of Nations failed. And one of the reasons the League of Nations failed was precisely because some of the big powers of the day, the powerful countries that could actually destroy world peace, did not join the United Nations, the League of Nations, that is the United States, did not join the League of Nations. And some who did join were expelled by the League of Nations. So Germany, Italy, Russia at various times were expelled. And when the World War started, they were not even in the body for the body to influence their behavior. So when the United Nations was created at the end of the Second World War, the countries of the world wanted to avoid the mistakes that had crippled the League of Nations. And so they created a guarantee for the 5 major countries in the world at that time that they would never have the UN do anything against their interests because they would have a veto on decisions of the Security Council. And that was why when the United Nations Security Council was set up, 5 countries were given permanent seats with a veto. And when they all agree, wonderful things can be done by the UN. The UN has won 6 Nobel Prizes. But when they don't agree, the UN is unable to act because, for example, on the Ukraine war, Russia itself is obviously a participant and they are not going to allow any resolution to be passed against their interests. They would veto it. And on the Gaza matter, there is no doubt that the Americans would support Israel fully, and they too have been vetoing any attempts for the Security Council to impose any binding restrictions on Israel. So that is the reality we're facing today. Does that mean the United Nations is useless? No, because it does a great deal else. And I think we must appreciate the outstanding work of the UN in a number of other fields. But at the same time, we must realize that the United Nations is a mirror of the world. It reflects our agreements and our disagreements. It reflects our inequalities, the power of some big countries and the lack of power of some others, and the lack of power of some other countries. It also reflects in many ways the fact that the United Nations is also a mirror of our imperfections as human beings. Oh, that's okay, thank you. I'll wait for the water. For our imperfections, in fact, the second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, said 75 years ago something very memorable. He said the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but rather to save humanity from hell. In other words, the best the UN can often do is to prevent matters from getting worse. And I think that the United Nations is able to do, because when countries are obliged to be accountable to the United Nations, to the criticism of other governments, to discussions in the Security Council, they're at least conscious. They're also always conscious that there is something that they need to be able to do in order to impress or persuade world opinion, and that may not be much, but it will prevent the worst from happening.